It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Steve Bittner, who's in the history department. Professor Bittner is a Sovietologist, and he studies some of the most fascinating aspects of the Soviet Union. And he has a degree from the University of Michigan as well as a graduate degree from the University of Chicago. Not easily attained. And he has recently spent some time in a place where my ancestors come from, in the Soviet Union, and he is studying the winemaking region of the Crimea, which fascinates me to no end, and I take up a lot of his time wandering into his office, having me tell tales. He's a wonderful lecturer, and students really enjoy his lecture, which is The Holocaust in Historical Perspective. Would you please welcome Professor Bittner?
Oh, that was a good sound.
Right.
Well, I am back. I think this is my third or fourth time doing this. I should note that it seems that it's never been the case before that the Holocaust has been such a prominent item in the news as it has been the last couple months, right? We have the Pope rehabilitating a bishop who's a Holocaust denier. It doesn't get any better than that. I'll talk more about that in this lecture. We also have a fake memoirist, which was nearly an Oprah book. And I have to say that hits home, close to home for me, because I went to high school with the most famous fake memoirist of them all, James Frey. You guys know who James Frey is? Whose book about drug addiction turned out to be entirely contrived. Well, it turned out that Jimmy Frey was 1 year ahead of me. At St. Joseph High School. So has anybody read this book, A Million Little Pieces? Yeah, well, you know, he completely disses his hometown, says it was a place where a bunch of hicks lived. Well, that was my hometown, too. So he got what he deserved, I think. Well, I should also admit that I am certainly the least accomplished speaker of the semester here. This lecture series really attracts some serious talent, and you're going to see some of that over the course of this semester. And I guess the second disclosure I have to make is I am not a historian of the Holocaust. I'm a historian of the Soviet Union, of Russia and the Soviet Union. So I am an outsider to the field which you are going to be dedicating the next 15 weeks to. And so what this means is if you ask me a really hard question, I have no scruples about saying I don't know or deflecting that question to Myrna or to somebody else who knows more about it than I do. But just because I'm an outsider, that doesn't mean that I haven't thought about the Holocaust a great deal. In fact, there's a good deal of theoretical overlap in the literature on Nazism on one hand and Stalinism on the other hand. And these two phenomena, the two great dictatorships of the 20th century, are joined by the concept of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a word, it's like terrorism. It's so overused that it's almost devoid of meaning altogether. But 50 years ago, two Harvard political scientists, Zygmunt Brzezinski and Karl Friedrich, used it to refer to regimes like the Soviet Union and like Nazi Germany that had totalizing ambitions. That is, according to Brzezinski and Friedrich, regimes like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union sought to control every aspect of life. In fact, in its extreme manifestation, they argued that totalitarian regimes destroyed even the will to resist. So what happens in private was also shaped by totalitarianism. And then Stalinism and Nazism are also linked by the concept of genocide, although less frequently, and in my mind, less satisfactorily. Is that a word, satisfactorily? I think that's a word. Because I really don't think the Soviet Union was ever genocidal, not like Nazi Germany was. The Soviet Union was a brutally authoritarian place where many hundreds of people died. But it seemed to have lacked a genocidal ideology like Nazi Germany, and I will talk more about that in this lecture. And by the way, I think this comparison between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, or Stalinist Russia, this is a comparison where the Soviet Union comes off looking pretty good. And this speaks to one of the great ironies, the great paradoxes of 20th century history, and that is the Soviet Union, a self-proclaimed communist country, saved the capitalist world from its own excesses by defeating Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And if you are so naive to believe that the Americans won the Second World War, I would encourage you to take my Soviet history class, because it was truly a war that was fought primarily between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, it's also true that the Holocaust was primarily an Eastern European and Soviet event. And this is important, because as Americans, our image of the Holocaust tends to be one of Vichy collaborators in France and Anne Frank holed up in her attic in Amsterdam. But the truth is, the vast majority of persons who perished in the Holocaust resided in the eastern part of Europe. In fact, if we include the lands that were partitioned by the Soviet Union in 1939, and that's a euphemism, partitioned, right? They were actually overrun by the Red Army in 1939 on September 15th, 1939, 2 weeks after the war began. About half the victims of the Holocaust were Soviet citizens. So that means half of the 6 million were citizens of the Soviet Union. And indeed, the heartland of European Jewry, the place in Europe where most European Jews hailed from, was in Poland, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. So that historically is where Jews resided in Europe. And this is, according to Tsarist law, this was called the Pale of Settlement. In fact, until quite late in Russian history, Jews weren't allowed to reside outside of the Pale of Settlement. And I'll talk about that as well. So I think, even though I'm not an expert on the Holocaust, it does intersect my field in many different ways, and I have thought about it a great deal. Now, if I were to ask you what the Holocaust was, I'm confident you could all answer. In fact, you probably wouldn't be in this class if you had no idea what the Holocaust was. Of course, the Holocaust was the process whereby German soldiers and German political leaders and bureaucrats like Adolf Eichmann and their non-German abettors planned and implemented the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and smaller numbers of Roma. What are the Roma? Gypsies, yeah. Slavs, handicapped persons, homosexuals, and communists. Now, as such, the Holocaust is the central event in all of German history. I think it is without question the central event in modern European history. It colors our understanding of what it means to be German and what it means to be European. It forces us to rethink events as distant as the Enlightenment. What is the Enlightenment? Yeah.
Period in Europe, mainly in France, where religion was put on the back burner and science and discovery came to the forefront of people's thoughts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the Enlightenment is it's an era that began sometime around the year 1650, and it lasted really until the American and the French revolutions. And the Enlightenment gives us this very dangerous idea that human existence can be perfected if only we apply the rational concepts from the world of science to the realm of politics. Now that idea, the idea that human existence can be perfected, is the cause of more bloodshed over the last 200 years than virtually anything else. And it comes to us from the Enlightenment. And here in the States in particular, we tend to think of the Enlightenment as this good thing, right? It gave us the ideas that undergird our own republic. It produced the French Revolution. Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, all Enlightenment thinkers, Washington, Jefferson. The Enlightenment also produced the Holocaust, and that is a much harder thing to grapple with. So we know what the Holocaust is. But if I were to ask you why the Holocaust happened, I suspect you would find it much more difficult to answer. Why, after all, did hundreds of thousands of seemingly normal, seemingly intelligent, and otherwise moral German citizens participate in mass murder? And then why did millions and millions of people stand by and do nothing to stop the mass murder once it had begun? And as the historian Daniel Jonah Goldhagen pointed out a few years ago, your answer to this question, why the Holocaust happened, would probably have as much to do with the nature of human existence, what Joseph Conrad called the heart of darkness that supposedly resides in all of us, as it would with the individual motivations of the persons who participated in mass murder. And I am not so naive as to believe that we can answer this question today or this semester. In fact, I'm pretty confident that in 100 years, this question will still be asked here at Sonoma State and at other universities across the country, and we'll still be debating why the Holocaust happened. But today, what I hope to do today is to provide you with some conceptual tools so you can begin to answer this question on your own. And what I will argue today is that there were certain structural developments that, in my mind, facilitated the Holocaust. And then I'll move on to the specific circumstances that brought the Nazis to power and how they went about persecuting the Jews. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about how historians have made sense of the Holocaust. So the big conceptual frameworks we've brought to bear on the Holocaust. So let's start with the structural factors that undergirded or laid the foundation for the Holocaust. Well, the first is certainly anti-Semitism. And here I have to refer to the Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer, former speaker in this lecture series, who pointed out that this is really a stupid term, anti-Semitism, because it supposes that there is a doctrine of Semitism to be opposed to. But of course, there is no doctrine of Semitism. In fact, there's no such thing as Semitism. Well, what exactly is Semitism? But nonetheless, in its common usage, this word anti-Semitism refers to animosity toward Jews, but not towards other Semitic peoples. And who are some other Semitic peoples? Arabs. Yeah, so anti-Semitism refers to hostility to Jews, but not to Arabs. And in some forms, anti-Semitism is as old as Christianity itself. And many verses in the New Testament, if you are familiar with your Bible, many verses will strike you as anti-Semitic. And there's probably a reason for this. The reason is that they reflect tension in the early Christian church between Jews who accepted the new religion and Jews who refused to accept the new religion. But, of course, much of Christian anti-Semitism hinges upon one idea in particular. And this is what got Mel Gibson in trouble a couple years ago. And the idea is that Jews were somehow responsible for the death of Christ. And according to the book of John, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor in Jerusalem, was ready to pardon Christ in the hours before his crucifixion, but he was convinced otherwise by a hostile Jewish crowd. And then according to the book of Matthew, Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, helped fabricate evidence against Jesus. Although a fuller reading, in all fairness to the author of the book of Matthew, a fuller reading suggests that Caiaphas wanted to stave off a Roman military response by sacrificing Christ. Now, as a result of this, until the 20th century, it was accepted doctrine in the Catholic Church that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. And this alone was often the cause of a great deal of popular animosity towards Jews in Europe. When the plague hit Europe in the 14th century, there were persistent rumors that Jews had poisoned the water, and that was why everybody was getting sick. And of course, what causes the plague? Yeah, fleas that live on rats, and these fleas probably arrived in Europe with the Mongols, who also swept into Russia at about this same moment. There were also rumors all across Europe that Jews used the blood of Christian children in their Passover matzahs. Now, along with Muslims, Jews were targeted by the Crusades. When were the Crusades?
800.
What's that?
800?
800? No, a little bit later than that, the 11th through the 13th centuries. Jews were the object of the Inquisition, this arm of the Roman Catholic Church that prosecuted heresy. In the 12th and the 13th centuries, Jews were repeatedly expelled from France. They were expelled from Spain in 1492. In fact, many of the Jews who ended up in the Pale of Settlement could trace their families to the Iberian Peninsula. Jews were expelled from parts of Prussia. Prussia, not Russia. What is Prussia? Cheryl, you know what Prussia is, right? What is Prussia?
Yes, isn't it Persia and Russia together?
Persia? No. Prussia is the forerunner to the modern German state, right? So you think of the land in what is northern Germany today and Poland. That used to be part of a state called Prussia. And in the Russian Empire, of course, Jews were forced to live in the Pale of Settlement. In large parts of Eastern Europe, Jews were forbidden from owning land, and hence that most pernicious of stereotypes, the Jew as money changer or the Jew as lender, right? Because that's the only way Jews could make a living if they were forbidden from owning land. Unexpected or unexplainable tragedies frequently resulted in pogroms. This is a wonderful Russian word, pogrom. Grom is the root for storm, and pa makes it diminutive. So it would literally translate as a little storm, a pogrom. But of course what it referred to was a popular uprising against Jews. So anti-Semitism has been with us for a very, very long time. But that does not mean that it hasn't changed. In fact, over the course of the 19th century, anti-Semitism was really transformed. It became less religious in orientation, and it became increasingly obsessed with race. So it be less religious and more racial. And this reflected really two developments that were going on at the same time. First of all, Jews who resided in Europe were becoming increasingly assimilated. That is, they moved out of the shtetl, the old villages of the Pale of Settlement. They moved into cities. Many were no longer practicing. They were in English we have this wonderful description, lapsed Catholic. Well, I think you could probably describe many of these people as lapsed Jews. They didn't practice. They didn't go to synagogue. Men did not wear the beards and the yarmulke. Women stopped shaving their heads after they were married. In the Russian Empire, movement in and out of the Pale of Settlement was tolerated. In the city where I was 2 weeks ago, Odessa, which is now in Ukraine, became the largest Jewish city in the world. At the dawn of the 20th century, 70% of the population of Odessa was Jewish. In fact, many American Jews can trace their family to Odessa. That was a popular point of departure to the New World. Now, the switch from religious to racial anti-Semitism also reflected one other development. And that is, in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, there were several pseudo-scientific theories that were in vogue. And these theories attributed defining physical and mental characteristics to various ethnic and racial groups. And we may not want to admit it here in this class, but we've all heard these stereotypes before, right? Germans are punctual, Irishmen are drunkards, the French, what are the French? I don't know what the French are. Lovers, yeah, that's a good one. But Jews were associated with less savory characteristics. They were greedy, they were rootless, and they were cosmopolitan. Now, what does that word mean, cosmopolitan? Now, Myrna thinks that you guys only know that as a drink that contains cranberry juice and, what is it, cranberry juice and vodka? Or is that a Cape Codder? That's a Cape Codder. Or maybe it's grapefruit juice, I think. But what does it mean to be cosmopolitan? Well, it means to be sophisticated and worldly. And why is that a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing to be worldly? What's that? Well, yeah, but you remember 4 years ago in the presidential election how the Republicans made a great deal of hay about the fact that John Kerry speaks accentless French? Well, that suggests a lack of loyalty to the homeland, right? That amount of worldliness. And Jews have often been characterized as cosmopolitan. That is, they lack loyalty to the nation state in which they reside. Instead, they are loyal to the Jewish diaspora or to a transnational movement like Zionism, which I'll also talk about today. Okay? And I have a friend down at Berkeley, Yuri Sloskin, who has written a wonderfully provocative book. And you may not like this book, but I really loved it. It's called The Jewish Century. And Yuri argues that insofar as Jews were pegged as cosmopolitan 150 years ago, they really are the harbingers of the modern age, because this becomes one of the characteristics of the modern man. The modern man is cosmopolitan in outlook. Well, let me show you a slide here. Hopefully this will work. Okay. So we know that ethnic groups were pegged with certain physical or mental characteristics. And here we have a photograph from a German elementary school. And I don't know exactly what's going on here, but presumably this boy is being taught what the defining characteristics of the good German are. And I don't know if all those people up on that chart are German or not. Okay, well, you may have noticed that there's actually a contradiction here. that Jews were pegged as being greedy, and they were also seen oftentimes as being sympathetic to communism and to socialism. So is it possible to be a greedy communist? I think that's oxymoronic, right? You can't be a greedy communist. These two characterizations would rule each other out. And this is what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, who used to be at Brown, I don't know if he's still there anymore, this is what he calls the viscosity of Jewish identity. And viscosity, this is a word we usually use in conjunction with motor oil, right? It measures the lubricating capacity of an oil. And Bauman argues that Jewish identity has always been slippery to anti-Semites. To some anti-Semites, Jews are arch-capitalists. They're greedy. To other anti-Semites, Jews are socialists and communists and are a threat to the free market system. And oftentimes, people can have the same, a single person could hold the same view, could hold both of these views of Jews without realizing how contradictory they were. Now, this is hardly an exhaustive list of the indignities that Jews have been subjected to over the last 2,000 years, and it's really not meant to be one. But I do want to point out one big thing that the historian Jan Gross makes in his study of the Holocaust in the Polish city Jedwabne. And that is, before the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, from the perspective of Jews, was a lot like an intractable, low-intensity war. Particularly in the East, in Poland, in Belarus, in Russia, in Ukraine, Jews had to be savvy to survive. A careless comment, a careless look could result in a pogrom. But the point is that a low-intensity war is survivable. In all but a few extraordinary cases, the Holocaust was not. And that is what makes the Holocaust unique. Okay, so that's it for anti-Semitism. I want to move on now to the second structural characteristic that I think underlays the Holocaust, and that is nationalism. And what is nationalism? Seems like I've talked about nationalism in all my courses this week. So what is it? Yeah. Pride. So would you distinguish between nationalism and socialism? Or, excuse me, nationalism and patriotism? Yeah, okay. Well, we know it's a doctrine, right? Any word that ends in ISM is a doctrine. And nationalism is a doctrine that holds that each nation should have its own state. And this has also been a very powerful force in the modern world, nationalism. And despite what nationalists say, and nationalists are very good at locating the origins of their nations in the very distant past. For instance, I was reading this morning that about how Serbian nationalists claim that the Serbian nation has existed since the 14th century. But in fact, nations are relatively recent phenomena in human history. The oldest nation, which is probably France, has only existed for about 200 years. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't a French state. Clearly, there was a French state prior to 1789, but there wasn't a group of people who considered themselves to be French. And because they could perceive of themselves as French, they thought they had the right to their own state. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon. In Western Europe, the signal event for nationalism and for nationalists was the French Revolution, which located political sovereignty in the broad citizenry rather than in a narrower group like the aristocracy or even in a royal family. In Central and Eastern Europe, where territories were incorporated into multinational empires or independent principalities, nationalism was shaped in powerful ways by a cultural movement called Romanticism. And in its broadest sense, Romanticism refers to a movement in art, in thought, in cultural sensibility, where feeling and sentimentality and imagination are emphasized instead of science and rationality and logic. And Romanticism reflected or grew out of a growing skepticism in Europe about the notion that historical progress was inevitable. The French and the American revolutions seem to suggest that history was nothing more than the story of one success after another. Human existence was getting better, right? The sort of idea from the Enlightenment that human existence can be perfected. And the French and the American revolutions seem to suggest there might be something to this idea. Romantics were always skeptical of that. Romantics were anxious about the extent and pace of social and cultural change. Romantics were really the first conservatives. I think that's a good way of thinking about this. Romantics were skeptical about science. They were skeptical about claims that man had mastered the secrets of nature. Romantics always felt this sense of vulnerability and anxiety. And there's a couple romantics here that I will mention. I guess the two most important are both Germans, Johann Gottfried von Herder and the composer Richard Wagner. And both Herder and Wagner celebrated folk culture in their artistic composition. They thought that in folk culture was the uncorrupted soul of the nation. So in other words, if you want to see what it means to be German, you don't go to a university in Berlin. You don't go to the theater or to the symphony. You go to the German village. And in folk culture, you will see the uncorrupted soul of Germanness. And both Wagner and Herder argued that folk culture was immutable, that the folk culture in 1800 was the same as what it had been 1,000 years earlier. And that what defined a German or a Czech or a Pole was being a participant in this folk culture. Now, so there's an irony here, right? These romantic nationalists were often polyglot intellectuals. They spoke several different languages. They were familiar with all the European cities and the best cafes in these cities. But they idealize the lives of illiterate peasants. And there's a certain amount of self-loathing here. They saw these peasants as being more authentic than themselves. Now, as a political doctrine, nationalism is, I think, without question, the most successful of all time. Over the course of 100 years, Europe ceased to be a continent of empires, and it became a continent of nation-states. That is, states that existed for certain national groups. So, how did this happen? Well, probably after the French Revolution, probably the first nation-state that comes into existence is Serbia. Serbia wins its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1815. In 1829, Greeks rebel against the Ottoman Empire. In 1859, Romania gets its independence. Italy in 1861. Germany in 1871. Bulgaria in 1878. Albania in 1912. Czechoslovakia, that's a strange one because it's two nations sharing the same state. Czechoslovakia in 1918. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, Ukraine, Turkey. So by 1920, Europe, for the most part, is a collection of nation states. But nationalism caused problems as well. And I think you all have a handout here. Oh, what happened? Hope, can you go up there and put it back on slideshow? So you have this handout. Oh. Not sure why those are at the end. Okay, well, just leave it on that view. That's fine. You see that the borders that were drawn around nation states weren't perfect. And so it's not the case that the only people who lived in, say, the German nation state were ethnic Germans. In fact, there were large numbers of Jews who lived in Germany, and there were large numbers of Germans who lived outside of their nation state. And can you go forward one slide now? Hope. Okay, one more slide. Okay, and you see that some of these East European countries actually had quite sizable German populations. In Czechoslovakia, there were more than 3 million Germans. And of course, these were the Germans, the ethnic Germans who occupied what was called the Sudetenlands, the southern lands that were annexed to Germany after the Munich Conference. But even if we go all the way to the Soviet Union, to the USSR here, we have a very large ethnic German population, which had been there since at least the time of Catherine the Great, at the end of the 1700s, and in some instances, even earlier than this. As Mirna indicated, I'm writing a book about the history of Russian and Soviet winemaking, and it appears that the first grapes that were cultivated in Russia were cultivated by German colonists in the 17th century, near the city of Astrakhan on the lower Volga River. So nationalism caused problems. The borders that were drawn weren't perfect. Romanians lived in Russia. Ukrainians lived in Poland. Germans lived in Czechoslovakia. Turks lived in Bulgaria. Millions and millions of Europeans lived outside their titular nation state. And then there were Jews. Jews had a nationalist ideology, Zionism, but they did not have a nation state. And they wouldn't until after the Second World War. Okay, so that's it for the second structural factor. Now I want to move on to the third. And the third is militarism. So by 1870, every European power maintained a standing army. What does that mean, a standing army? Is this an army that stands up? What is a standing? Yeah. Yeah, it used to be the case that armies only existed in times of war. In times of peace, there was no need to maintain an army. This changes over the course of the 19th century. Armies become increasingly a career path. And armies are always in existence, regardless of whether the nation is at war or at peace. So by 1870, every major European power has a standing army, and they are spending increasing sums of money on weapons production. Between 1875 and 1914, military spending doubled in France, and that's adjusted for inflation. It tripled in Germany, and by 1914, the military accounted for roughly 1/3 of the entire Russian state budget. Anybody know what the figure here is in the United States? Well, it's half of discretionary spending, right? And what is discretionary spending as percentage of the total budget? Now, it's about, discretionary spending is about a half of the total budget. The other half is entitlements. So half of a half gives us a quarter, which is still quite a bit, but less than Russia on the eve of the First World War. By 1914, there were some 19 million men and women in uniform across the European continent. And military thinking and military values began to pervade European society. And what this meant is that the idea of violence became culturally acceptable. And this was true across the political spectrum. So on the left, Marxists, in the middle, liberals, and on the right, social Darwinists. All these people thought that violence, that struggle between peoples, was historically necessary. Jingoism, which is a very bellicose form of nationalism, a sort of nationalism that says, we're great and you suck. Jingoism became the approved standard of patriotic expression across Europe. And this jingoism was evident in extremely low desertion rates once World War I finally began. The French command, in the months leading up to the First World War, anticipated that desertion rates would be somewhere between 5 and 15%. Right? And it was easy for French soldiers to desert because they could literally just walk home in many cases. But in reality, once the war began, the French desertion rate was about 1.5%. And that suggests a great deal of popular enthusiasm, right, to participate in this war that was entirely senseless. Technology also spurred on the arms race. The French introduced the machine gun in the 1860s. What is a machine gun? Yeah, right, where the bullets are actually on a belt, right, and they feed up into the firing cylinder. And actually it was invented too late to make any difference in the American Civil War, but comes in the 1860s. New industrial processes made possible the development of far larger and more accurate artillery. By 1914, the Germans had artillery pieces that could launch shells 75 miles. And what this meant is they could park an artillery piece in Holland and launch a shell across the English Channel. Warships were made with iron bottoms rather than wood. And this made possible the development of what was called the dreadnought. That's what the British called it. We call it a battleship, which is simply a floating artillery platform. And then, even more ominously, nations began to experiment with chemical weapons. And of course, chemical weapons were widely used during the First World War, but often not very successfully. The people who used the chemical weapons often turned out to be the ones who perished from them when the wind direction changed. Okay, so any questions about this all? We got anti-Semitism, we got nationalism, and we have militarism. And I think those are the factors that underlay the Holocaust. Okay, well, then I will actually move on then to how the Nazis came to power. Nazis built upon the failures of German liberalism. And in the aftermath of the First World War, Germany reinvented itself as a democratic republic. In fact, for a brief time, it was probably the world's most democratic state. It was called the Weimar Republic because it was created in the city of Weimar, which is in eastern Germany. And the Weimar Republic lasted until 1933. It was very democratic. It also had many, many weaknesses. And of course, you probably know one of the biggest weaknesses of the Weimar Republic. It was saddled with the onerous reparations that were put on the German state by the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the First World War to an end. And interestingly, to Woodrow Wilson's credit, he was against reparations, but Clemenceau and David Lloyd George were not. But it was also, the Weimar was also paralyzed by political polarization. For instance, the Weimar Republic was declared on November 9, 1918, right? Armistice Day. That very same day, a group of German socialists proclaimed the formation of a pro-Soviet German Socialist Republic. So actually, Armistice Day saw the creation of two German regimes, a pro-Soviet socialist regime and the Weimar Republic. And then in 1920 and 1923, there were right-wing uprisings in the Weimar Republic, and this reflected popular disenchantment over the German economy. But really, the signal event for Weimar came in the summer of 1929, when the American economy slipped into recession. And in October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange tanked. It was even worse than it is today, believe it or not, although not that much worse. Europe collapsed within just a couple of weeks. After the crash, American financiers were no longer able to continue infusing capital into Europe. And this was especially destructive for Germany because Germany relied on loans from American banks in order to pay the Versailles reparations. And by 1932, American investment in Europe had fallen by about 70%. And this would be the equivalent of China ceasing to buy our T-bills, which would really bring the American economy to a halt should it happen. So not surprisingly, Germany was the first state to witness political upheaval on account of the American recession and the blossoming Great Depression. In parliamentary elections in September of 1930, German voters stunned the pundits by handing 107 seats to the National Socialist Party. In 107, there were 611 seats total in the German Reichstag. So 107 is a significant amount, but clearly not a majority. Overnight, the Nazis had gone from being an inconsequential fringe party that was seemingly populated by a bunch of lunatics to being the second biggest bloc in the Reichstag. And so the Nazis seem to be the prime beneficiaries of the unfolding global economic crisis. And of course, we know the Nazis were led by Adolf Hitler, right? Hitler was Austrian by birth. He was born in 1889. As a young man, he had dabbled in painting. In fact, he aspired as a teenager to be a painter, but he was denied admission to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. If only he had been accepted. In fact, some of his artwork I've seen, it was really quite kitschy. He was certainly not an avant-garde sort of artist. Hitler served with the German infantry in the First World War, and he was twice awarded the Iron Cross, which is the German equivalent of the Purple Heart, for surviving poison gas attacks. After the war, Hitler joined the Nazi Party. He did not found it, he joined it. And National Socialists, this requires a little bit of explanation. Socialist is not meant to be understood here in the Marxist sense. So the National Socialist Party was never a socialist party like the Soviet Communist Party. Rather, socialist in this context referred to the sense of solidarity that German veterans of the First World War supposedly felt for each other. You know, that these people had fought in the trenches with each other. In 1923, as a member of the Nazi Party, Hitler was arrested for participating in a coup against the Bavarian government in Munich. He and the other coup plotters were arrested before they could do any serious damage. But Hitler was sentenced to 9 months in prison. And it was
What's
coup. C-O-U-P. Well, that's a fancy French word, which refers to an attempt to topple the government. Thanks for asking that, so everybody's clear what I'm talking about. While in prison, Hitler wrote the book that would become the Bible of the Nazi movement. It was called Mein Kampf. What does that translate as? Yeah, so even if we don't know German, we know that, right? Mein Kampf. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out his view of history. And it was clear that he was very much in dialogue here with socialist thinkers who espoused a Marxist view of history. Marxists believe that class struggle is what pushes history along. Well, Hitler argued instead that history was the product of struggle between races. Okay, so not class struggle, but racial struggle. And Hitler thought that the master race, what he called the Aryans, and he had in mind here not only the Germans, but also the English, the master race, the Aryans, were ordained by God, Hitler thought, to be the implacable foes of lesser races, like Slavs and especially the Jews. Yeah?
When you say by God, do you think that Hitler was religious?
I don't know, do you have any sense on that, Mirna?
He never renounced his Catholicism, and they also had the Nazis had a religion of their own.
Yeah, and part of this could be artistic flourish too, right? It just sounds better when you say we're ordained by God to do this. A lot of atheists even claim that sort of thing. Okay, so according to Hitler, Germany... Oh.
Right here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wasn't the Aryan idea not Hitler's original idea? Wasn't it someone else?
Mirna?
It wasn't his original.
Yeah, no, Hitler was not the founder of this party. And Hitler is inserting himself into racist ideology that already exists. Now, according to Hitler, Germany had to adopt an aggressive foreign policy in order to achieve its historical destiny. He thought that the German army had to conquer what he called Lebensraum, living space, in the eastern part of Europe, so Germans could achieve their destiny. He argued in Mein Kampf that this would anger France. France and Germany had gone to war with each other in 1870 and 1871, but he thought that the British would never intervene to stop German expansion, because the Brits, after all, were also Aryan, or the English were also Aryan. And so he believed that this racial solidarity would trump whatever fears the British had about German expansion. And so we see here really by the mid-1920s the core elements of Nazi ideology in Hitler's writing. We have racial superiority on one hand, and then the need for expansion on the other hand. And this provided the basis for future Nazi policies in the 1930s. Now, Hitler came to power in Germany almost by accident. Despite the elections of 1930, where they won 107 seats, they still played second fiddle to the largest party in Germany, the Social Democrats, a left-of-center party. By 1932, the Nazis had become the strongest party in numeric terms in Germany, but they were still far from a majority. In 1932, they controlled 230 of the 611 seats in the German Reichstag. And there's even some evidence that suggests in late 1932 and early 1933 that electoral support for the Nazis was beginning to wane. and it was actually shifting to the communists. So it was shifting from the far right of the political spectrum to the far left. And this suggests, I think, that it's actually not a political spectrum. It's a circle, right? If you go far enough right, you actually begin to come back left. And so the Nazis and the communists were appealing to a similar sort of voter. But there were a lot of political pundits who thought at the end of 1932 that the Nazi phenomenon appeared to be waning, thank God. Now, ironically, that the Nazi seizure of power can be attributed, at least in part, to the commitment among German social democrats to the creation of a liberal democracy. And the German chancellor tried to convince the German president, Paul von Hindenburg, to simply ban the Nazi and communist parties in 1932. Now, why can't you do that? Why can't you just ban an odious political party? Was really committed to these ideals, and so he refused to ban the Nazi party. But he realized that something had to be done about these lunatics. And his solution seemed ingenious at the time, but in retrospect, it clearly backfired. And that is, in January of 1933, Hindenburg offered Hitler the chancellorship. And can you go down one slide here? Okay, so here we actually see, this is a photo of Hitler being brought into the German cabinet as chancellor. As chancellor, Hitler would rule over a cabinet that contained only 3 other Nazis among its 11 seats. And what Hindenburg thought is that once Hitler was in power, he would be forced to moderate his politics. He would be forced to act more responsibly. And there's a good deal of evidence that suggests that politicians do, in fact, do this. They say absurd things when they campaign, right? But once they actually get in power, they tend to act like an adult. That's not always true, though. Certainly not in this country. And even Hindenburg even thought that Hitler would, at best, he could be a puppet who could be easily controlled by the mainstream parties in the cabinet. But once Hitler was chancellor, he moved quickly to consolidate power. He demanded that new elections be held to the Reichstag. And these elections were scheduled for March 1933. But on February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag building burned down. And can you go ahead a slide? Oh. I guess I don't have a picture of the Reichstag. I thought I did. One more. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had a picture of the Reichstag. But the Reichstag building burned down. And Hitler claimed that communists had set fire to the Parliament building. In retrospect, we learned that it was probably a Nazi arsonist who set fire to the Reichstag. But by noon of the following day, February 28th, 4,000 communists had been arrested in the streets of German cities. And Hindenburg, the president, signed an emergency decree which suspended individual liberties, basically suspended the Constitution. And in the ensuing days, Nazi thugs terrorized their political opponents across the country. And this set the stage for a Nazi electoral triumph on March 5th during the Reichstag elections. The Nazis won 44% of the seats in the Reichstag, but they had allies in a small party called the Nationalist Party. And with the support of the Nationalist Party, they were able to rule the Reichstag. And less than 3 weeks later, at the end of March, the Reichstag approved what was called the Enabling Act. And the Enabling Act authorized the government of Adolf Hitler to rule by decree for 4 years. so to rule without parliamentary approval. And so Hitler had become a dictator by the end of March 1933, even though the Nazis had never won the votes of a majority of German citizens. Now, two factors made the Nazi expansion so rapid. First of all, the Nazis had no scruples about relying on coercion. They had a very effective secret police organization called the Gestapo, and later it was called the SS. And secondly, tens of thousands of people joined the Nazi Party because they decided it would be good for their careers to help the Nazis. The institution that was most likely to give Hitler trouble was the army, the military. And it's clear that the leading generals in the German military thought that Hitler was a lunatic who was only going to get Germany involved in a war it could not win. But of course, military support was absolutely essential to Hitler because he needed military support to pursue this aggressive foreign policy where Germany would gobble up territory in the east. So Hitler had to do something about the opposition in the army, and that something came on June 30, 1934, in what was called the Night of the Long Knives. And he accused several prominent generals of homosexuality, and he ordered the SS to assassinate them. And 5 weeks after this, in early August 1934, Paul von Hindenburg died of natural causes. And Hitler then united the office of Chancellor and the office of the presidency. Now, effective opposition to the Nazis might also have come from the Christian churches in Germany. And it's clear that if you look at who actually voted for the Nazis in 1933, the Nazis were drawing a great deal of support from Protestant middle-class voters. Yet most Protestant clergymen tried to remain politically neutral. So the clergy, even though their parishioners were voting for the Nazis, the clergymen, for the most part, refused to openly endorse the Nazi government. In a small number of cases, Protestant clergymen even actively opposed the Nazi regime. And the sort of most famous example of this is the Protestant theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who perishes in a concentration camp and becomes one of the great German heroes in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Now, in 1933, Hitler signed a treaty with the Vatican. And in 1933, the leader of the Vatican is Pope Pius XI. And Pope Pius XI gave his stamp of approval to the Nazi regime in return for recognition of the traditional confessional liberties that Catholics had in Germany. So in other words, even though Germany was a majority Protestant state, Catholics would not be persecuted. At least this is what Pius XI thought he was getting. And by signing this pact with Nazi Germany, Pius XI was basically undermining the ability of what was called the Catholic Center Party in Germany to oppose the Nazis, because the Pope himself has given the Nazi regime his stamp of approval. And in retrospect, Hitler's assurances to the Pope proved to be useless. The Nazis ruthlessly attacked Catholic schools and Catholic youth organizations through the 1930s. And eventually, by 1937, Pope Pius XI decided that he had made a terrible mistake. And so he issued what was called an encyclical. And an encyclical is like a papal essay. And this encyclical was titled "With Burning Sorrow." And he, in this encyclical, he denounced all forms of totalitarianism, so Nazism and Stalinism. But he did not attack Nazi anti-Semitism. At best, he turned a blind eye to the suffering of millions and millions of Jews in Europe. At worst, he actively abetted in the persecution of Jews. Now, of course, Nazi racism was directed primarily at Jews. And after coming to power in 1933, Hitler expelled most Jews from state administrative positions. 2 years later, in 1935, he issued the infamous Nuremberg Laws. Nuremberg Laws denied German citizenship to persons with 2 or more Jewish grandparents. So that becomes the official definition of Jewishness, 2 or more Jewish grandparents. The Nuremberg Laws prohibited marriage and sexual intercourse between Jews and non-Jews. The Nuremberg Laws required Jews to wear the yellow Star of David in public. German towns could refuse residency to Jews, and German businesses were forced to fire their Jewish employees. Now, Jews, of course, weren't naive about what was going on. And by 1938, about 100,000 Jews had fled Germany. And if they were lucky, they fled to Switzerland or to America. But oftentimes they fled to parts of Europe where they later got caught up in the mechanisms of the Holocaust. And so their reprieve turned out to be temporary. But whatever Jews remained were subjected to an incessant campaign of violence. Yeah.
Why didn't others try to leave? Is it just because they couldn't economically?
Well, if we thought that something, we know there's going to be a really bad earthquake here in California, right, at some point in the future, but we're not leaving. It was impossible to anticipate that the sort of scale of violence that awaited, these people down the road. I mean, who would have thought that genocide was around the corner? Those Jews who remained were subjected to incessant violence. On November 8th, 1938, Nazi terrorists subjected the Jews who remained to the Night of the Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. And I do have some pictures of this. And Mirna, I want to ask you, is it a coincidence that Kristallnacht was on Armistice Day? No? So is this the sort of betrayal?
They say it's the night of the 9th and the 10th.
Yeah. Okay, so this was the betrayal of the home front, when the home front betrayed the troops in the trenches. Scores of Jews were killed on Kristallnacht. Thousands were dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets. 200 synagogues were burned. 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Now, interestingly, Hitler's government blamed the Jews for the disturbances of Kristallnacht. And in the aftermath of the violence, 25,000 Jews were incarcerated for their behavior. Now, these early attacks on Jews were part of the disemancipation phase of Nazi policy, right? They're making Jews less than citizens of Germany. Now, what made the Nazi program so unique is that this, in the end, was insufficient to satiate Nazi animosity. That in the end, genocide was what the Nazis turned to. Now, of course, Hitler wanted Lebensraum, living space in the East, and to this end, he authorized Heinrich Himmler to put together what were called Einsatzgruppen, special action units, that as the German army moved into Poland and then in 1941 into the Soviet Union, they were followed by these Einsatzgruppen who went about quite methodically murdering Jews and Slavs and communists. And I have a picture of this as well. Here you see these people are lined up on graves that they have undoubtedly dug themselves, and they are about to be murdered. Millions of Soviet citizens died in this way. Some 3.7 million Soviet prisoners of war were also summarily executed in this manner. Now, of course, even lower than the Slavs in the Nazi racial hierarchy were Jews. And Hitler was determined to eradicate as many of the 11 million Jews who lived in Europe as possible. Soon after the outbreak of war, on September 1st, 1939, Jews in Poland were herded into ghettos, first in the city of Lodz, and then in Warsaw. And actually, we have an expert on the ghettos here, our very own Hope, who is writing her master's thesis on this. And it was from the ghettos, of course, that Jews were corralled and sent to concentration camps. The ghettos weren't supposed to be concentration camps themselves, but the living conditions were often so terrible that people were dying in large numbers in the ghettos anyway. Now, at first the ghettos were meant to be a temporary expedient to isolate Jews from the rest of society, the rest of the human community, until their ultimate fate could be decided. And that fate was decided in July of 1941 at the suburb of Berlin called Wannsee. January 1942, when Hermann Göring, at Hitler's command, gave the fateful order for the mass extermination of Jews. And this was called, euphemistically, the final solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. The Nazis determined that execution by machine gun was too slow and too costly and too inefficient. The preferred method of execution was the gas chamber, and the gas chamber had several advantages. After death, anything of value on the body could be removed, dental fillings. The corpses could be burned in crematoria. They could be boiled and turned into soap, or they could be used for fertilizer. The most notorious of these concentration camps, of course, was Auschwitz. Can you go ahead? One more. And this is, of course, the gate, the front gate to Auschwitz. You see, work makes you free, is what greeted people as they arrived. Auschwitz was a model of German efficiency. And you see here how I have attributed to Germans a certain characteristic, right? Germans are efficient. And Auschwitz was emblematic of this. Auschwitz was capable of killing up to 12,000 people a day. By the end of the war, by the end of the Second World War, Auschwitz alone was responsible for the murder of 2.5 million people. And some 2.5 million people in concentration camps, and about 500,000 through barbaric treatment, basically being worked to death. The Nazi plan to exterminate inferior peoples included gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, the mentally ill. Between 1938 and 1941, the Nazis perfected their gassing techniques on 70,000 mentally ill Germans. German scientists eventually came up with a form of cyanide called Zyklon B that turned into a gas when it came into contact with the air. But even at its most efficient, Zyklon B took 15 or 20 minutes to kill its victims. Now, at first, Allied leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin, were incredulous at the reports of genocide that were filtering out of Nazi-occupied Europe. But even when those reports were confirmed, the Allies made no effort to bomb the camps or to bomb the railroad lines that led to the camps. There were underground church groups, mostly Protestant ones, who assisted the Jews. but Pope Pius never condemned the atrocities, even when Jews were herded into cattle cars in Rome itself. And in fact, there was scant sympathy for Jews among the Roman Catholic clergy, especially in Poland, where the clergy was bitterly anti-Semitic. There were instances of heroism. The Danes, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Italians organized large underground resistance networks that saved tens of thousands of Jews from murder. But really, efforts to blame the slaughter of the Holocaust on a handful of deranged Nazis is really, I think, morally indefensible. There were tens of thousands of people who were directly involved in the murder of people, from German soldiers and German politicians, French collaborationists, Polish clergy. The list goes on and on and on. And very few of these people were ever brought to trial after the war had ended. Now, I promised you that I would end a little bit with how historians have tried to make sense of the Holocaust. And here I'm really out of my realm, so what I will say will be necessarily brief. But it used to be the case that there was one great divide in the historical profession when it came to the Holocaust. And this divide broke down between the intentionalists on one side and the functionalists on the other. And those are two not very sexy ways of describing these two historical schools. But let's start with the intentionalists. The intentionalists argued that the Holocaust was the product of Nazi willfulness. So in other words, if you want to find the roots of the Holocaust, you look in Hitler's Mein Kampf. Right? So Hitler had an idea, and he acted on that idea. The Nazis had a master plan to destroy the Jews, even in the early 1920s, and once they seized power in 1933, they set about implementing that plan. Now, the functionalists argue that, in fact, there was no master plan to eradicate the Jews, even though they recognized that there was deep anti-Semitism among Nazi leaders and in German society. And the functionalists argue that the Holocaust was the product of a specific confluence of events. So it was basically a bunch of things. You can think of it as an hourglass. If you turn an hourglass on its side, you have this point where the glass converges on each other. So all these events converged on each other, and they produced the Holocaust. The functionalists tend to emphasize rivalries within the bureaucracy. And I think Hannah Arendt's work on Adolf Eichmann is often cited as supporting the functionalist view of the Holocaust. Now, more recently, and by more recently, I probably mean the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a tendency to look beyond this divide. I already mentioned Daniel Jonah Goldhagen. Goldhagen's work is similar to that of a historian at the University of North Carolina named Christopher Browning. And Browning has written a book called Ordinary Men, where he tries to determine the individual motivations that people had for participating in the Holocaust, in particular German soldiers who participated in the killing. Why did they do this, right? Because in the end, it does come down to an individual deciding that he or her was going to participate. And then I think even more interesting than that is the work of a historian at NYU named Jan Gross. And Gross is a Pole, a Polish patriot. And he wrote a very controversial book called Neighbors, where he looks at the events in one Polish village called Jedwabne. And Gross finds that, in fact, the Germans played a peripheral role in the Holocaust as it played out in this Polish village. That it was the Poles killing the Jews who lived amongst them. And often the Germans trying to restrain the scale of killing. For this work, Jan Gross has been roundly vilified in his own country and has received numerous death threats. But it is provocative work nonetheless. And then last, I'll mention the sociologist whom I brought up earlier, Zygmunt Bauman. Bauman argues, or Bauman tries to place the Holocaust within the broader trajectories of modernization. Bauman argues that the defining characteristic of the modern state is that it tends to be a gardening state, what he calls the gardening state. So a wonderful metaphor. And by this, he has in mind modern states take an interest in the welfare of their populations. And like good gardeners, there are two ways of doing this. You fertilize some parts of your population, and you weed other parts. Okay, and Bauman argues that all modern states are basically the same in this regard. They are all gardening states. But of course, Nazi Germany was a perverse manifestation of the gardening state, the weeding that goes on in a gardening state. Okay? But what is so provocative, I think, about Bauman is he would argue that the GI Bill, this sort of American legislation that makes it possible for people who serve in the military to go to college, the GI Bill and Auschwitz are two sides of the same coin. They are both motivated by the same underlying garden state mentality that is present in modern states. Okay? I don't know, you like Bauman? Okay, well, that's all I have. And I'm happy to take your questions insofar as I'm able to answer them. But that's all I have prepared for today.